Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When my parents asked me to move out, I thought it was because they wanted me to be independent, to start my own life, to finally stand on my own 2 feet. But then they offered me money, actual cash, to pack up and leave as soon as possible. And the reason? So my sister and her family could move in instead. I should have seen it coming. She had always been the favorite, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I was just convenient to have around until I wasn't anymore. At first I thought fine. If they didn't want me there, I wasn't going to beg to stay. I took the money, got my own place, and figured that would be the end of it. But now they're begging me to come back. Because it turns out, living with my sister and her perfect little family isn't as perfect as they thought it would be. And the best part? I don't owe them anything anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, expecting nothing more than one of those casual family talks my parents like to spring on me from time to time. Maybe they wanted to discuss my job, my future, the usual well-meaning but slightly suffocating questions about when I was finally going to get serious about life. I had been living with them since I finished college, working, saving money, trying to figure out my next step, and I assumed they were about to push me in that direction. But when my mom slid a plain, white envelope across the table toward me, something in my stomach twisted. There was no preamble, no warm-up, no attempt at easing me into whatever was coming. I hesitated for a second before picking up the envelope, my fingers already tense, my heart already beating a little too fast. When I opened it, I found cash. A few $1,000s, neatly stacked, and a small handwritten note tucked on top that simply read, "For a fresh start." I barely had time to process it before my dad cleared his throat, his voice even, firm, almost rehearsed. "We think it's time you moved out." And just like that, everything changed. I stared at the envelope, then back at them, waiting for the punchline, waiting for some kind of reasonable explanation, waiting for them to tell me that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But there was no warmth in my mother's face, no hesitation in my father's tone. They weren't asking. They were telling me. I swallowed hard, my voice tight, my fingers gripping the edge of the envelope like it might anchor me in place. "Why now?" I finally asked, my throat dry. "Why the sudden urgency?" My mother shifted slightly in her chair, the first crack in her carefully put-together demeanor, her eyes flickering toward my dad as if waiting for him to take over the conversation. When he didn't, she inhaled and said, "Your sister needs a place to stay." I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't speak. "Not yet. Julia and her family are going through a rough time," she continued, as if I didn't already know that. As if Julia's financial struggles hadn't been the background noise of our family's conversations for years. Her husband lost his job, and with the kids, it's just too much for them right now. They need help, and we have the space. I blinked at her, waiting for the next part, waiting for the piece where they explained why that meant I had to go. My room was mine. I had been here for years. But then it hit me all at once. I was the space. I was the obstacle standing in the way of their perfect little plan. "You're kicking me out," I said flatly, the words feeling foreign in my mouth, the reality of them sinking in as I said them out loud. "So Julia can move in?" Neither of them corrected me. Neither of them denied it. I let out a breathless laugh, shaking my head, looking between them like I might suddenly wake up and realize this was some kind of twisted joke. But my dad only sighed, his expression unreadable, like he was already tired of this conversation. "We're not kicking you out," he said, though the words felt hollow. "We just think this is the right time for you to start your own life. You're an adult, you've been working, you've been saving. This is what's best for everyone. For everyone. Everyone except me." I should have been angry. Maybe I was somewhere underneath the disbelief, the numbness, the bitter realization that this had never been about what was best for me. This was about Julia. It had always been about Julia. I could have argued, could have pointed out the absurdity of forcing your own child out of the house while bending over backward for the other one. But I already knew it wouldn't matter. My parents had always made excuses for her, had always justified her mistakes, had always prioritized her needs over mine. This was just another chapter in the same tired story, and I was just too exhausted to fight it anymore. So I nodded. Just once. I picked up the envelope, tucking it into my jacket pocket, my fingers still clenched tightly around it. If they wanted me gone so badly, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me beg to stay. "Fine," I said, pushing my chair back, standing up, already calculating how quickly I could pack my things and get out of this house that had never really felt like home. My mom frowned, her lips pressing together like she hadn't expected me to accept it so quickly. "Sweetheart, it's not like we don't love you." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. "You don't have to do that. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You made your choice. I'll be out by the end of the week. I didn't stay to hear their response. I didn't wait for some last-minute attempt to soften the blow, for some meaningless reassurance that this was for my own good. Instead, I went straight to my room and started packing, shoving clothes into suitcases, gathering up the pieces of my life that they had decided weren't important enough to keep around. By the time I left, I didn't even look back. I told myself that this was a good thing, that this was my chance to finally be free, that this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I could build something on my own. But even as I unlocked the door to my new apartment, even as I settled into my new space, even as I started this new chapter of my life, a bitter thought clung to the back of my mind. I hadn't moved out. I had been replaced. For the first few months after I moved out, it was as if I had never existed in that house, as if my absence had made no impact, as if Julia and her family had stepped in and effortlessly filled the space I left behind. My parents acted like everything was perfect, like their decision had been the right one, like I had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience that had finally been removed. My mom would occasionally send me texts with photos of Julia's kids playing in the backyard, captions filled with smiley faces and exclamation marks, gushing about how wonderful it was to have a full house again. My dad, never one for long conversations, would call me briefly just to mention how nice it was to have the family together, as if I had never been a part of that family to begin with. I didn't respond much, didn't ask for details, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing whether or not their decision had affected me. I was too busy building my own life, creating a space that was truly mine, a place where I wasn't just tolerated but actually belonged. The apartment I moved into wasn't fancy, wasn't anything special, but it was quiet, peaceful, free of tension, free of comparison, free of the suffocating presence of a sister who had spent her whole life making sure I always felt like I was second place. It wasn't easy adjusting to doing everything on my own, wasn't easy covering rent, bills, responsibilities that had never been entirely mine before. But even in the hardest moments, it was still better than living in a house where I had always felt like a guest. And then, just when I had finally settled into the idea that this was my life now, the calls started. At first, they seemed harmless, casual, like my parents were just checking in, like they had suddenly remembered that I existed. My mom would ask how I was, my dad would make brief small talk, and then the conversation would shift subtly but noticeably. They weren't just calling to check in. They were calling because things at home weren't as perfect as they had imagined. My mom's voice, once filled with excitement about having Julia back home, sounded thinner now, more strained, like she was trying to convince herself that everything was fine. My dad, never one to complain much, started making offhand comments about how it's a little chaotic, but we're managing, his tone a little too forced, a little too tired, a little too different from the man who had so confidently told me it was time for me to leave. I could already guess what was happening before they even said the words. Julia wasn't the perfect house guest they had expected. At first, my mom made excuses for her, acting like everything was just a little adjustment period, just a temporary situation, just something that would smooth itself out with time. She would say things like, Julia has a lot on her plate with the kids, or it's been a big change for everyone, but we're getting through it. But the longer these calls went on, the more I could hear the cracks in her voice, the exhaustion creeping in, the quiet resentment that she wasn't ready to admit out loud yet. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. Because I knew exactly what was happening. Julia had never been responsible, had never been the kind of person who took care of things, had never been someone who pulled her own weight. She had spent her whole life getting what she wanted without consequence, without effort, without ever having to prove that she deserved any of it. And now my parents, the same people who had spent years making excuses for her, bailing her out of every bad decision, prioritizing her happiness above everything else, were finally getting a front row seat to the reality of who she actually was. And I was watching it unfold from the sidelines, free for the first time in my life. But things didn't just stop at subtle hints of regret. One night, my dad called me. It was late, later than he would normally call, and his voice was different. Not just tired, but drained, like whatever was happening at home was slowly eating away at him. She's not even trying, he muttered, more to himself than to me. We do everything, and she doesn't care. I leaned back against my couch, twirling my phone charger between my fingers, pretending to be indifferent even though I was hanging onto every word. That sounds frustrating, I said, keeping my voice neutral, letting him feel every ounce of the frustration that I had lived with for years. He sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that carried years of exhaustion, years of finally realizing something that should have been obvious a long time ago. Your mom won't say it, but she's at her breaking point. The house is a mess. The kids destroy everything. Julia and her husband don't lift a damn finger to help. We thought this was going to be temporary, but he cut himself off, as if saying the truth out loud was too much to handle. But I already knew the truth. They had made a mistake. They had chosen Julia over me, had pushed me out to accommodate her, had handed her everything without a second thought. And now, they were realizing, too late, that Julia wasn't the solution to their loneliness. She was the cause of it. So what are you going to do about it? I asked, my voice carefully detached, carefully void of the satisfaction bubbling under the surface. There was a long pause. My dad cleared his throat, as if trying to buy himself time, as if trying to find a way to phrase what he really wanted to say. But I already knew. I already knew because I had seen this story play out before. They were going to expect me to fix it. And that was never going to happen. I don't know yet, my dad admitted finally, his voice heavy with unspoken words, with regret, with the realization that for the first time in their lives, they couldn't rely on me to clean up Julia's mess. I smiled to myself, tilting my head back against the couch, exhaling slowly as I let the silence stretch between us. Well, good luck with that, I said casually before ending the call. They had wanted Julia. They had chosen Julia. Now, they were stuck with her. It turns out that having your grown daughter, her unemployed husband, and 2 screaming children living under your roof isn't quite the picture-perfect family life my parents had imagined. At first, they were so blinded by the excitement of having Julia back home that they didn't see the warning signs, the constant noise, the mess piling up, the never-ending stream of demands coming from my sister, her husband, and their 2 completely unhinged kids. But reality has a funny way of catching up to people who refuse to see the truth. And for my parents, that reality hit them like a freight train. I could hear it in my mom's voice every time she called me, the exhaustion creeping in, the quiet frustration building beneath the surface, the hesitation before answering when I asked how things were going. At first, she tried to sugarcoat it, to act like everything was fine, to pretend that having Julia's family in the house was everything she had dreamed of, but the cracks in the fantasy were growing wider every day. It's just an adjustment period, she told me once, her voice tight with barely contained irritation. The kids have so much energy, and Julia's husband is still looking for work, but we're managing. I let her words sit for a moment. Let her feel the weight of them. Let her own exhaustion sink in before responding. And when exactly does this adjustment period end? I asked, my voice neutral, my curiosity purely for entertainment purposes. Because from what I remember, Julia has never exactly been good at adjusting to anything that requires effort. My mom sighed, long and heavy, the kind of sigh that spoke volumes, the kind that told me she knew exactly what I meant, but wasn't ready to admit it out loud just yet. The truth was, Julia had never been responsible a day in her life. She had spent her entire childhood getting what she wanted, avoiding consequences, and somehow always convincing everyone else to clean up the messes she left behind. Now, for the first time, my parents were experiencing what it was like to deal with her without me there to absorb the fallout. And they were absolutely miserable. It didn't take long for my dad's frustration to start bleeding through, especially when he realized that Julia and her husband had no intention of contributing financially, no sense of urgency about their situation, and absolutely no concern for the fact that they were slowly draining my parents dry. The plan had been that Julia's husband, Mark, would find a job and start pulling his weight, that they would pay for groceries and utilities, that they would at least try to be responsible adults. But months had passed, and instead of job applications, Mark was sitting on my dad's couch every single day, flipping through channels, watching reruns of old sitcoms like he had nothing better to do. He says he's looking. My mom told me during one of her many late-night phone calls, her voice strained, her patience wearing dangerously thin. But every time I ask if he's heard back from anywhere, he just shrugs and says the job market is tough right now. And Julia? I asked, already knowing the answer. Another sigh. She's busy with the kids. I almost laughed at that because Julia had never been busy a day in her life. Even when we were kids, she had a way of making sure everyone else did the work while she sat back and took credit. If there was a group project in school, Julia was the one who volunteered to manage the team while doing none of the actual work. If there were chores at home, Julia suddenly had a headache or too much homework or some other flimsy excuse that my parents always accepted without question. And now she was doing what she had always done, letting other people take care of her life while she acted like it wasn't her problem. My dad, normally the one who avoided confrontation, was finally hitting his limit. I came home from work yesterday, and the sink was overflowing with dishes. He grumbled over the phone, his voice unusually sharp. The kids had destroyed the living room. The laundry hadn't been done in days. And Julia was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like none of it was her responsibility. I could hear the undercurrent of anger in his tone, the frustration of a man who had spent his whole life bending over backward for his daughter only to realize, far too late, that she had never once done the same for him. "So what did you do?" I asked, not even trying to hide my amusement at the situation. There was a pause, a long one. Then, in a voice that sounded like he was swallowing glass, my dad muttered, "I did the damn dishes." That was when I knew they had completely lost control. They had kicked me out so Julia could move in, had prioritized her over me, had given her everything she wanted without a second thought. But now, as they stood knee-deep in the consequences of their choices, they were realizing something that I had known for years. Julia was never going to take care of them. She was never going to help. She was never going to grow up. And now, they were stuck with her. The best part? I wasn't their fallback plan anymore. I should have felt bad for them. I should have said something comforting, something that reassured them that things would get better, that they would work things out, that Julia would eventually get her act together. But instead, I leaned back against my couch, smirked at the ceiling, and said, "Wow, that sounds really tough." My mom sighed again, this time heavier than before, this time with the weight of someone who was finally understanding what I had lived with my entire life. "Yeah," she muttered, almost to herself. "It really is." I smiled, stretching my legs out in front of me, enjoying the silence, enjoying the knowledge that, for once, this wasn't my problem to fix. They had made their choice. Now, they were stuck with it. The first time my mom called and asked me to come over for dinner, I almost ignored it, almost let it go to voicemail, almost pretended like I was too busy to deal with whatever crisis was brewing in the house I had been so graciously pushed out of. But something in her tone made me pause. Something in the way she hesitated before speaking. Something in the barely concealed exhaustion in her voice that told me this wasn't just a casual invitation. "It's been a while," she said, attempting to sound lighthearted, but failing miserably. "We thought it would be nice to have you over, like old times. Just for dinner." I leaned back against my couch, my phone pressed to my ear, letting the silence stretch between us, letting her feel the weight of the request she was making. We both knew this wasn't about family bonding, wasn't about missing me, wasn't about anything remotely sentimental. This was about something else, something unspoken but painfully obvious. They were drowning. So I agreed. Not because I wanted to help, not because I missed them, not because I had any intention of fixing whatever mess they had created, but because I was curious. I wanted to see it for myself, wanted to step into that house and feel, for once, what it was like to be on the other side of the disaster instead of the one cleaning it up. And the second I walked through that front door, I knew I had made the right choice. The house looked nothing like the home I had left. It was a mess, an absolute, undeniable, inescapable mess. Toys were scattered across the floor like landmines. Dishes were stacked so high in the sink that I could smell the remnants of whatever meal had been cooked days ago. Clothes were draped over the backs of chairs, over the railing of the stairs, over any surface that could be used as a dumping ground. And my parents? They looked like they had aged a decade in the few months since I had left. My mom's eyes had dark circles underneath them. Her hair was messier than usual, and she had the posture of someone who had completely given up on fighting a losing battle. My dad, always the composed and stoic one, looked disheveled in a way I had never seen before, like a man who had spent too many nights lying awake, wondering where everything had gone wrong. And Julia? Julia was exactly the same. She barely acknowledged me when I walked in, barely looked up from her phone, barely registered the fact that I had stepped into the house she had taken over. Her husband, Mark, was sprawled out on the couch, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, watching television like he had absolutely nothing better to do. The kids, predictably, were running wild, screaming at the top of their lungs, jumping on furniture, throwing things without a care in the world, and no one, not Julia, not Mark, not even my exhausted parents, made a single effort to stop them. I took it all in, let it settle, let the weight of it sink in, let myself feel the sharp contrast between this house and my own quiet, clean, peaceful apartment, and I had to bite back the smirk threatening to creep onto my face. This was what they had chosen over me. Dinner was tense. My mom had made an effort to set the table properly, to create some sense of normalcy, to pretend like this wasn't an absolute disaster. But no one was really talking, no one was really engaged, no one was making any real attempt to mask the discomfort simmering beneath the surface. I ate slowly, taking my time, watching the way my mom's hands trembled slightly as she passed me the mashed potatoes, watching the way my dad exhaled heavily after every sip of his drink, watching the way Julia scrolled through her phone, completely oblivious to the tension suffocating the room. Then, halfway through dinner, my dad cleared his throat, setting his fork down with a deliberate slowness, like he was building up to something. You know, he said, his voice carefully neutral, carefully practiced, carefully avoiding the weight of what he was about to ask. We've been thinking, maybe it would be nice if you moved back in for a little while. I almost choked on my food. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for some kind of follow-up explanation that would make this request make any kind of logical sense. Move back in? I repeated slowly, my tone perfectly even, perfectly calm, perfectly masking the amusement bubbling beneath the surface. As in back here? Into this house? My mom jumped in then, her voice quick, eager, desperate to sell me on an idea that she already knew I had no intention of entertaining. It wouldn't have to be permanent, she said, forcing a smile, forcing a kind of artificial warmth into her tone that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just for a little while, you know, to help out, to bring some balance back into the house. Balance? I echoed, raising an eyebrow, watching as my mom flinched slightly at the realization that she had used the worst possible word to try to convince me. Things have been difficult, my dad admitted, his voice quieter now, more tired, more resigned. Your sister is still adjusting. And the kids. He cut himself off, shaking his head slightly, running a hand down his face like the mere mention of Julia's kids was enough to drain the life out of him. We just thought it might be good for everyone if you came back for a bit. I exhaled slowly, setting my fork down, taking a moment to let them really sit with the absurdity of what they were asking. They had kicked me out to make room for Julia. They had paid me to leave. They had chosen her over me without hesitation. And now they wanted me back because she had turned their lives into an absolute nightmare. I glanced at Julia, expecting some kind of reaction, expecting her to at least pretend like she cared about what was being discussed, but she didn't even look up from her phone. She was completely indifferent to the destruction she had caused, completely uninterested in the fact that our parents were on the verge of breaking under the weight of her selfishness. I almost laughed. No, one word. One simple, final, indisputable word. I stood up, grabbed my coat, pushed my chair back into place, and gave them a small, polite smile. Thanks for dinner, I said, my tone light, my posture relaxed, my heart thrumming with the satisfaction of finally being the one to say no. I turned and walked toward the door, feeling their stunned silence behind me, knowing that for the first time, they were the ones being left behind. They had made their choice, and now they could live with it. The silence that followed my words was heavy, thick with the weight of expectations that had just crumbled before my parents' eyes. My mom looked stunned, her lips slightly parted like she had been so certain I would say yes that she hadn't even considered the possibility of rejection. My dad, ever the pragmatic one, let out a slow, measured exhale, as if already bracing himself for what came next. And Julia? Julia had the audacity to look offended, like my refusal was some kind of personal insult, like I had just committed some unforgivable betrayal. I watched as she leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and let out a dramatic sigh, her frustration practically radiating off of her in waves. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, rolling her eyes in that familiar, dismissive way she always had whenever something didn't go her way. "It's not like you have anything better to do. You're just living alone in some tiny apartment, right? I should have expected it. Should have known that Julia would find a way to turn this into something about me rather than the absolute disaster she had created for herself. That was how it had always been. When things didn't go her way, she lashed out, redirected, tried to make herself feel bigger by making everyone else feel small. But what she didn't realize, what she had never stopped to consider, was that I wasn't that person anymore. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and smirked at her over the rim. "Actually," I said, my voice light, my posture relaxed, my entire demeanor the picture of effortless ease. "I love my apartment. It's peaceful. You wouldn't understand." The way Julia's face twisted at that? Absolutely priceless. My mom jumped in before Julia could say anything else, her voice laced with forced optimism, desperate to salvage the conversation before it spiraled out of control. "Sweetheart," she said, her tone soft, almost pleading, "we just thought it would be nice to have you home again. Things have been a little hectic, and well, you were always such a big help around the house." There it was. The truth. They didn't want me back because they missed me, didn't want me back because they suddenly realized how much they valued me, didn't want me back because they wanted to make things right. They wanted me back because they needed someone to clean up the mess. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, making sure they were all really listening. You know, I said, tilting my head slightly, I used to wonder why you pushed me out so easily, why you didn't even hesitate to choose Julia over me. But now I think I get it. I glanced at Julia, whose expression had darkened considerably, then back at my parents, who suddenly looked very, very uncomfortable. You didn't push me out because you thought I needed my own space. You pushed me out because you thought Julia would be easier. You thought that taking care of her and her family would be some kind of beautiful, fulfilling experience. And now that it's turned into a nightmare, you want me to come back and fix it. No one spoke. For the first time in my life, they had nothing to say. I stood up, adjusting my jacket, glancing down at the untouched food on my plate, feeling nothing but satisfaction as the silence stretched on. I should go, I said casually, pushing in my chair. But, best of luck with everything. I started toward the door, already feeling the weight of the evening lifting off my shoulders, already feeling like I had just won a battle I hadn't even known I was fighting. But before I could leave, my dad spoke. Wait. I turned, eyebrow raised, waiting. He ran a hand down his face, looking exhausted, looking desperate in a way I had never seen before. What if we helped you out financially? He asked, his voice carefully controlled, as if testing the waters, as if hoping this might be the thing that changed my mind. We know rent isn't cheap. If we covered some of your expenses, maybe it would make sense for you to come back for a while. I blinked at him. They had paid me to leave, and now they were offering to pay me to come back. The irony was almost too much to handle. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head, marveling at just how far things had fallen apart for them. You still don't get it, do you? I asked, watching as my dad's jaw tightened, as my mom's eyes darted away, as Julia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't want her money. I don't need anything from you. I have my own life now, my own place, my own freedom. And trust me, there is no amount of money that would make me give that up just to move back into this mess. My dad exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples like he was finally beginning to understand the reality of the situation. Julia, however, still wasn't ready to let it go. Wow, you really think you're better than us now? Huh, she snapped, her voice sharp, defensive, filled with the kind of bitterness that only comes from someone who has lost complete control of a situation. I turned to her, letting my smirk widen just slightly, letting her see exactly how much I wasn't affected by her tantrum. No, I said simply, I just don't make the same mistakes twice. And with that, I walked out. The sweet taste of karma lingered long after I had left the house, long after I had driven back to my apartment, long after I had settled onto my couch with a glass of wine, knowing, without a doubt, that this time, they were the ones left picking up the pieces. Because for the first time in my life, their problems weren't my responsibility anymore. The more I refused to move back, the more desperate and relentless my parents became, as if they couldn't comprehend that I had no interest in cleaning up the mess they had created for themselves. At first, their calls were subtle attempts to manipulate the situation, little comments about how much they missed me, how different things felt without me around, how the house just wasn't the same anymore. But when those soft nudges didn't work, when I continued to hold my ground, they switched tactics, and suddenly, the guilt-tripping became unbearable. My mom, always the more emotionally dramatic of the two, was the first to crack. She started calling me every couple of days, her voice thick with exhaustion, her sentences carefully crafted to make me feel like I was abandoning them in their time of need. We just need a little help, she pleaded one evening, her words dragging out as if she barely had the energy to say them. Things are getting difficult here. Difficult. I almost laughed. Oh, you mean having to deal with Julia's mess, Julia's laziness, Julia's entitled attitude, and Julia's absolute refusal to take responsibility for her own life? The same Julia they had chosen over me, the same Julia they had thrown me out to accommodate, the same Julia they had always defended no matter what she did? What a shame. I wasn't sure if my mom expected me to feel sympathy, if she thought I would suddenly break down and offer to swoop in and fix things, if she honestly believed that I was still the same person who had spent years sacrificing my own comfort just to keep the peace. But I wasn't that person anymore. Wow, Mom, I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral, carefully detached. That really does sound tough. But, I'm sure Julia will figure it out. She's always been so good at solving her own problems. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. That's not fair, she said finally, her voice quieter now, more hesitant, more unsure. She's going through a rough time, and we're just trying to be there for her. I could have let it go. I could have ended the call right then and there, could have given her some vague excuse about being busy, could have let her sit in the discomfort of her own choices. But I was done protecting them from the truth. You kicked me out for her, I reminded her, my voice sharper now, my patience finally starting to wear thin. You didn't just let her move in. You made room for her by pushing me out. And now that it's backfired, you expect me to come back like nothing happened? She didn't respond right away. I could hear the distant sound of voices in the background, could picture her standing in the kitchen, one hand pressed to her forehead, trying to come up with something, anything, to say that would make me change my mind. But for the first time, she had nothing. And then the real kicker came. My dad called me the next day. He never called me directly. The second I saw his name pop up on my screen, I knew this wasn't going to be just another guilt trip, wasn't going to be some half-hearted attempt at convincing me to reconsider. My dad wasn't the emotional one, wasn't the type to beg, wasn't the type to get involved unless things were truly spiraling. And the moment I picked up, the moment I heard the tension in his voice, I knew exactly how bad things had gotten. I'll pay you, he said, his tone blunt, direct, devoid of emotion, like he was negotiating a business deal instead of speaking to his own child. If you come back, we'll pay you just like we did when we asked you to leave. I nearly dropped my phone. They were trying to buy me back into the house. I could have laughed, could have thrown his words back in his face, could have reminded him how quickly they had shoved money into my hands the first time, how eager they had been to push me out as long as it meant they could welcome Julia and her family with open arms. But instead, I just sat there gripping my phone, letting the weight of what he had just said settle in. They weren't just asking anymore. They weren't just hoping I would come back out of the goodness of my heart. They were so desperate, so completely out of options that they were willing to pay me to fix it. Let me get this straight, I said slowly, my voice almost too calm, too steady, too amused. You paid me to leave, and now you're offering to pay me to come back. It's not like that, my dad muttered, already annoyed, already irritated that I wasn't jumping at the opportunity, already frustrated that I wasn't making this easier for him. We're just asking for a little help. It's not permanent, just until things settle down. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head because it was exactly like that. No, I said, my tone final, firm, unshakable. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it. My dad sighed heavily, like he had already known that was going to be my answer, like he had still held on to some shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, I would be stupid enough to fall for it. But I wasn't stupid, and I wasn't coming back. I hung up before he could say anything else, before he could try to push further, before he could find some other way to twist the situation into something that made me feel obligated to say yes. Then, I sat back, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet satisfaction sink in. They had chosen Julia over me. They had made their decision. And now, they were the ones who had to deal with the consequences. Hearing my dad offer me money to come back should have been funny, should have been something I could roll my eyes at and forget about, but instead it just left me with an overwhelming sense of disgust, a deep-rooted exhaustion that made my stomach twist. They didn't want me back because they missed me, didn't want me back because they had realized they were wrong, didn't want me back because they suddenly cared. They wanted me back because I had always been the easiest solution to their problems. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a convenience. First, they had paid me to leave, had all but shoved me out the door with a wad of cash and a half-hearted excuse about fresh starts and independence. And now, they wanted to pay me to come back, to step back into the role of the person who held everything together, to fix what they had broken, to take on the mess that they had willingly created. I almost asked how much they were willing to pay, just to mess with them, just to make them say it out loud, just to watch them squirm as they realized they were trying to bribe their own child into bailing them out. But honestly, it didn't matter. There wasn't a number in the world that could make me go back into that house, could make me take on the role of unpaid maid, full-time babysitter, an emotional punching bag, could make me throw away the peace I had finally found just to appease the people who had never once put me first. So I ignored the calls, let the texts pile up, let them sit in their own chaos for a little while longer. And then, just when I thought they had finally given up, just when I thought they had finally realized that I wasn't going to cave, something happened that made everything so much worse. Julia called me. She never called me. Ever. The second I saw her name flash across my screen, I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button, my gut already telling me that this wasn't going to be anything good, that whatever she wanted, it was going to be dripping in entitlement, laced with manipulation, filled with the same unbearable self-importance that had defined her our entire lives. I answered, "Are you seriously playing hard to get?" She snapped before I could even say hello, her voice sharp, irritated, like she was the one being inconvenienced here. "Just come back already. Mom and Dad are losing their minds, and I am so sick of hearing about it." I laughed, genuinely laughed, because she actually thought she had the right to be annoyed. You know what's funny? I said, shaking my head, my amusement mixing with something colder, sharper, something that had been building inside me for years. You wanted me gone. You got what you wanted. And now you're mad because you have to deal with the consequences? Julia huffed on the other end of the line, and I could practically see her rolling her eyes, could picture the way she was probably pacing around, her arms crossed, her expression twisted in frustration, because for once, she wasn't getting what she wanted. This isn't just about me, she said, her tone clipped, like she was trying to convince herself more than she was trying to convince me. Mom and Dad are struggling. It's not fair to just sit back and watch them go through this. I let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of my nose, already regretting picking up the phone. Oh, you mean it's not fair for you to have to deal with the mess you created? That's interesting. Oh my God, stop being so dramatic. I almost hung up. Almost. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. Well, if you're not going to come back, you should at least know Dad's thinking about selling the house. The words hit me harder than I expected, knocking the breath from my lungs, settling into my chest like a weight I hadn't prepared for. Selling the house. The house we grew up in. The house they had chosen Julia over me for. I gripped my phone a little tighter, forcing my voice to stay steady. Excuse me? Julia sighed, like this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to her. Like this was just another problem she expected someone else to solve. They can't afford it anymore, she said, her tone completely devoid of emotion, completely indifferent, completely unbothered by the weight of what she was saying. Between the bills, the food, the damage from the kids, Dad's saying it's just not worth it anymore. He wants to downsize. Downsize. The house that had been in our family for decades. The house that had been my home before they had thrown me out like I was nothing. The house that they had practically gifted to Julia without a second thought was suddenly too much of a burden for them to handle. I took a slow breath, swallowing the bitterness rising in my throat. So let me get this straight, I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. They kicked me out so Julia could move in. They let her and her family live there rent-free. They bent over backward to accommodate her, to make her comfortable, to give her exactly what she wanted. And now, because she's completely incapable of taking care of herself, they're going to lose everything. Julia didn't say anything, didn't even try to deny it, because she knew this was her fault. And for the first time in her life, she had no one left to fix it for her. Wow, I said after a long pause, shaking my head, that really sucks. And then I hung up. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room, like the weight of every choice they had made had finally caught up to them. Like the walls they had built around their delusions were starting to crumble under the reality they could no longer ignore. Selling the house? The house we had grown up in. The house my parents had lived in for decades. The house that had held every holiday, every fight, every moment of my childhood. The house that they had chosen Julia over me for? I didn't even have to ask why. I already knew. They were drowning. Julia and her family had drained them, not just financially, but emotionally, mentally, in every way that mattered. They had assumed, naively, that Julia would pull her weight, that her husband would step up, that the two of them would eventually stop taking and start giving back. But instead, they had bled my parents dry, had consumed everything they could without a second thought, had used every resource until there was nothing left. And now my parents were looking at the only option left, getting rid of the house to escape the mess they had created. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel in that moment. Should I feel vindicated? Furious? Relieved? Maybe a little of everything, maybe nothing at all, maybe just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had seen this coming long before they ever did. They had made their choice, had pushed me out without hesitation, had prioritized Julia without a second thought, and now they were paying the price. A week passed before they finally reached out again. One last desperate plea, one last attempt to pull me back into the wreckage of their decisions. My mom's voice was different this time. Not just exhausted, not just frustrated, but defeated in a way I had never heard before. If we lose the house, we have nowhere to go, she said, her voice cracking slightly, like saying the words out loud was almost too much for her to bear. We just need some time to figure things out. I sat in my apartment, my home, the space I had built for myself, the life I had created without them. And for the first time, I felt completely, undeniably free. No more guilt, no more feeling like an afterthought. No more waiting for them to see me as something more than just a convenient solution to their problems. I took a deep breath, let the silence linger for just a moment longer, let them sit in the weight of everything they had done, and then I finally said the words I had waited my whole life to say. That's not my problem anymore. And then I hung up.